What's up, you guys? Oh, there's three key concepts in period 7, period 6. The first one, a lot of times people think of period 6 and they just think of the world wars, and it's just more than that, right? So 6.1 is all about science and technology, and really the 6.1 is a lot of changes. 6.2 is the actual global conflict. So for that, we'll get into the world wars and the Cold War. And then 6.3 is like more about economics in the 20th century and culture, right? So it's like science, tech, politics, and then 6.3 will be culture, society, and the economy. All right. At any point, if you have questions, just drop them in and I will do my best to answer them. All right. Don't worry. If you only learned about the world wars, don't worry. This is the stuff, like if there's any time period I know the best, it's 6. It's period 6. So I got you covered for this one for sure. All right. So key concept 6.1, science and technology. So like the biggest thing is when you think about the 20th century, there's just so much new technology, new advancements in all types of different fields. And that is really going to change the way that we live. It really, it changes the way that we communicate, the way that we travel, the way that we fight, like all these things have an effect on us. And now we're so dependent on technology that it's just, you can see the effects of that. So, okay, yeah, these are the same slides that I used in the YouTube video for this. So for period 6, so for 6.1, the first thing is about the new transportation that exists. So, cars, airplanes, space exploration, in the 19th century, it's like railroads are the big thing. In the 20th century, it's like, how can we move faster? How can we get more people into, transportation? Like owning your own car is such a new idea, like relatively new. Would big shipping boats fit in here? Yeah, probably. This is just the ones that it kind of lists here. So Henry Ford is like someone to connect with the car. This is more about like American history, but Henry Ford's really important in this because of the assembly line, and he would pay people $5 a day, which at that time was a pretty high wage. And then also because of the assembly line, it was cheaper to actually make the car, which meant they could sell the car for cheaper. So the car in general became more accessible, more affordable. So the amount of people who actually own cars really went up. Fun fact about Henry Ford, he was a raging anti-Semitic and a Nazi sympathizer. So am I a fan of Henry Ford? No. Super ew. Yeah. I will explain the space race. It will come up in here. It'll come up in a few minutes. When were the first cars introduced into the market? I'm not entirely sure when the first cars were introduced into the market. I know the Model T is like one of the most important cars that are introduced, and it's like the 1910s. Yeah, Dylan, I'm Jewish too, so I'm not a fan. But yeah, so Henry Ford, not a great dude. Okay. Oh, here we go. Space race. So in terms of the space race, basically you have during the Cold War, as soon as the Soviet Union gets the satellite Sputnik, that's in 1957, that's like terrifying for people. So there's already tensions between the Soviet Union and the US. By 1957, there's a lot of tensions. Now that they have a satellite, the concern for Americans is, can they put a nuclear weapon into space? Can they, what does that mean? Like, if you just think about outer space is already just like, do you have to know the space race for the test? Yes, you do have to know the space race. Just when you think about outer space, it's scary enough. When you think about it in terms of nuclear weapons, it's just like, ugh, I don't know what could happen. And so as soon as that happens, there's a race to get the best technology the fastest. So the space race is really like late 50s to like late 60s. And the US kind of wins that by getting to the moon. The Soviet Union gets a human into space first to like orbit the Earth. And then they also get the satellite into space first, but the US gets the man on the moon first. But the reason why this is really important is because it really affects, especially in the US, our education system. Because if we're going to fight a technology race, we have to have really smart people in math and science. Do you need to know specific missions? No way. Definitely not. The Apollo missions are just like the ones that got us to the moon. Okay, so new communication is, let's see, which of the essays / prompts will likely be about? It's hard to say. For right now, don't worry about the prompts. Worry just about the content, okay? Just kind of understand the story here. So new communications coming about, telephone, radio, internet. I mean, just in general, like mass communications, mass media makes this time period extremely different because we're so interconnected through our media. You know, television in particular, like you don't have pop culture the way that we do now until you have radio, you know, until you have television. Like just the fact that we can all engage around one event and not all have to be there is insane, you know, like we all experience something together. We watch like award shows together or sports games or whatever. And so that's a big change in family life, in advertising, in media, in pop culture. And so that is a big important change here. The changes in science, hold on, I'm just gonna silence this. New scientific theory. So you've got the theory of relativity, that would be Einstein. You've got quantum mechanics, the Big Bang theory, psychology, that would be like Freud. I think I've got a picture of two of them here. So there's Freud. He's connected to psychology and really thinking about your, you know, deeper inner thinkings and why you know, what the motivation of humans is like. And there you've got Einstein, who is just like brilliant with whatever he's brilliant with, physics. Do you have to know a lot about either of these things? No, but knowing that these two guys are in the 20th century, like you don't need to be able to explain psychology out very clearly or the theory of relativity, but knowing that those two things match with those two guys is good for you. Because this could be like some type of multiple choice question or something. That makes sense that Freud was on your psych test. Okay, new issues in the environment. So the greenhouse effect, climate change, you know, our environment has changed so much in the last 100 years, you know, especially even in the last 200 years when you include industrialization. But especially in the 20th century, there was just so much change to it. Erosion, deforestation, extinction of animals. Like a lot of animals, I think I have some pictures of them. A lot of animals go extinct forever in the 20th century. It's kind of a sad time for certain animal species. But all of those like different issues in the environment lead to different movements that we'll talk about in a little bit. And just like new pushes to protect the environment, conservationist theories, you know, like being an environmentalist, like those ideas didn't really exist before the 20th century. It's like things have to get really bad before people care about them a lot. You know, like I'm sure you can find environmentalists all the way throughout history, but you don't see it as like a movement until the 20th century. You know, you don't see it as this like larger thing that people can really get behind. And then obviously, you know, into today, that's still very much a, you know, big part of our national conversation, our international conversation. There are several diseases that are worth knowing for the 20th century that are kind of specific to the 20th century, and you can kind of categorize them in different ways. Basically, it's like, okay, so I'm trying to like explain this without giving you too much information. So some of these diseases that are listed here are infectious, are contagious. So like the Spanish flu, like AIDS, like cholera, Ebola, TB, those things. So what you have in the 20th century is you have, because of medical advancements, contagious diseases in the developed world will like slow down. Like we don't have huge outbreaks, you know, at least we haven't, of some of these contagious diseases, not including AIDS. You know, AIDS will be the like a difference there, but some of the other ones like cholera is a big deal with like in what is it called? Polluted water in the 19th century. And so like that really affected like places like London, the urbanized cities, or like the industrialized cities. But by the 20th century, doctors and scientists have kind of figured out ways to eliminate those diseases, either through vaccines or better like hygiene, better just like systems. But like the Spanish flu, for example, that's the flu after World War I. And the reason why that's able to spread so fast is globalization. Is like you have the war, and then people all go home from the war, and they bring with them the disease. So you see instances of the Spanish flu. So it's called the Spanish flu because people thought that it came from Spain, but it didn't. Spain just had like a lot of cases of it, but you can just call it like the flu of 1919. It doesn't matter. Spanish flu is fine too. So more people died from the flu than they did in World War I. Like the flu itself killed just more people worldwide, which is crazy. And a couple years ago, that was the DBQ prompt, was about the responses to the spread of the flu. Don't be alarmed if the DBQ is about a topic that you're like, come on, I studied all this stuff and the DBQ is on this tiny little topic. That's usually what it is. So don't be alarmed if that's the case. It's meant to be like one example in a larger development, you know? That's why they give docs, exactly. Then there's other diseases on here like Alzheimer's that is more about the like longevity of our lives, right? Like humans are living longer and longer. So we're dealing with new diseases that come about as we like, as our bodies just like, you know, get older and break down. And so like Alzheimer's isn't necessarily a problem when people die at the age of 40, right? When that's like the like average lifespan. But now people live until 80, until 90, and so we're more likely to see that. Yeah, more people died from the Spanish flu than World War I. Okay, so here is a picture of Red Cross workers during the Spanish flu. It was really scary. There's a lot of documents you can read. People just sort of blamed like religion, for example. There was all sorts of like scapegoats, and it just got really like stressful because they couldn't really stop it. And then I briefly mentioned this, but just like as a result of more populations, more science, some of those diseases, you also have medical innovations that will inevitably keep people alive for longer. So like polio is essentially eradicated. Polio used to be such a big problem, a disease that so many people would get, and polio is it will essentially make you paralyzed. That's what like FDR had. And so polio goes from having thousands and thousands and thousands of cases every year to virtually none. There's very, very few. And then other things like birth control are just a total game changer for women. You know, being able to plan your life out without, you know, children, that's completely changes the game in terms of opportunities. Here's a picture of like polio is still seen in, oh, this is cut off. Polio is still seen in some of the developing world. That's where we would see it. In like today in South or Southeast Asia, in Africa, there are still some places where polio exists. But for the most part, it's eradicated in the developed world. Other examples of that would be like smallpox, TB even. Could you argue that birth control promoted the presence of women in the workforce? Absolutely. Absolutely. Because like with birth control, it means that if you know, first of all, you have a say in when you have children. And then also just like kind of in line with that would be the conversation around abortion, which just means that like you just have a choice. You have a choice in what you want to do next. And that is choice in general. Like choice is always about opportunity and choice go together, right? As soon as people are given more choice, there are more opportunities for them. If they gave us a picture like that, they tell us it's from, yeah, they would tell you where it's from. Most likely they wouldn't make you guess. I mean, just based on these kids, I would guess this is from like South Asia, maybe Bangladesh. That would be my guess. Okay, some of the energy innovations. So it's like energy changes in the 19th century because it shifts to coal. In the 20th century, it shifts to like oil and then nuclear powers. That's kind of the shift of energy. Do you think we'd ever have to answer DBQ on how birth control affects population? So that's more human geography. But like, I don't think that's not going to be the whole topic of an essay. You might get, if you get an essay on just like general population trends, then you can talk about the fact that what increases the population in the 20th century is in part birth control, because more people will survive, essentially. Let's see. Yeah, it's mostly human geography. When did they start using hydroelectricity? I'm not sure the exact year. I would just say 20th century. Before, yeah. Human geography and AP World are very linked. Human geography just kind of explains the like locations of the world and why they matter and what the economy has looked like over time. It plays as a really well, like a good like pre-AP World course. If you take it after AP World, you'll pass that test. It's pretty easy compared to this stuff. All right, so that's what nuclear power plants look like. And just in general, we're trying to figure out, like, we moved towards fossil fuels in the 19th century, and now we're like, we can't keep using that. So now what? Now we got to figure out something better. Do I think you can self-study for human geography? Absolutely. I've helped some kids self-study for it. Petroleum is like oil. All right. Military technology is a massive piece here. And, as you are studying the wars, don't forget the technology that exists in both wars. In the First World War, tanks, planes, machine guns, mustard gas, those are some of the big ones that really changed the game for World War I, because World War I, if you think about movies, it's like people used to fight each other. They kind of like line up and run towards each other, and that might work just fine with swords, with, bows and arrows, but with machine guns, you can't really do that. Exactly. And so World War I is such a stalemate because it's fought with new technology using old strategies. And so they're kind of at each other, but they can't. The trench warfare exists because of things like, stalemate means like they're stuck. So they can't do anything with the machine guns. Like, you can't, as soon as you come up from the trench, there's a machine gun. So that changes everything. World War II, we get the atomic bomb, which obviously changes everything again too. And actually, there's a study about how since World War II, since 1945, these last, 70-ish years, 80 years, have been some of the most peaceful in all of history, which is kind of crazy to think about. It's like, part of that is because of, we just literally can't, like, with nuclear weapons, we are forced to be diplomatic more so than ever before. But most of what you would get in the last 80 years, it used to be that you'd get big powers fighting big powers, right? In the last 80 years, no big power has actually fought another big power. You don't actually have any shooting of each other of two like developed countries. All of the wars since World War II have been developed versus developing, or a civil war in between, like within one developing country, or it's developing versus developing, which is kind of an interesting twist. And that just has to do with the military technology, right? As soon as people have this technology, they can't fight as they could. Is that the reason why the Maginot Line failed? I mean, Germany just went around it too, but yeah, kind of, right? Like, you can't fight a war with new technology using old standards. So World War II, they have to readjust. All right, maybe Dylan, you can answer that question. I'm going to keep going. Would India be considered a developing country? Yeah, it would. India is probably like the biggest developing country. It's like a better way to say third world versus like first world is just like developed and developing. All right, so here's a tank. I don't remember which war this tank is from. I think maybe World War One. Here is the machine gun. This is a pretty famous picture with them wearing the like masks. The masks are protecting them from mustard gas, from poison gas that would be sprayed, which was just kind of crazy. And then, of course, the atomic bomb that has only been used, the one time. Okay, military tactics, which we talked about a little bit, changed. Trench warfare didn't exist because there was no need for it. And then firebombing. So just the idea of total war and with total war, you have increased civilian casualties. And really the goal of total war is to hurt the enemy. And so what you end up doing is killing the civilians in order to stop like production. Like you can halt war production by harming civilians, right? And so the idea of firebombing a city, of just like bombing the hell out of a city, and that happened in London, that happened in Tokyo, in Germany, that is brand new. Now work, yeah, you're not, right. So like, it's super not cool to the people, and it sucks because you had nothing to do with it, and you're like, okay, like there's bombs falling on the city, and so now, I don't think you can do that. Yeah, I don't know exactly how specific the rules are around it, like war tribunals and stuff. But yeah, obviously there's like a push to like not allow for that. Yeah, probably. American drones in the middle. Well, that's the thing, right? Is like it brings up new questions, because now it's not that we will like put a dude in a plane and he'll drop bombs. With drones, kind of draws the line, So in a lot of ways, we do still do this. I think we're not trying to harm civilians, but civilians are absolutely killed all the time. So here's trench warfare. Definitely know that term, trench warfare, because they're stuck in those trenches. Those trenches, by the way, were disgusting. And just like not healthy, not a great place to be. And then of course you like pick your head up a little bit and you could just be shot right away. So it's just, they're just kind of stuck there for a very long time. This is a picture of Tokyo in World War II after they were firebombed. Diseases that were spread in the trenches. Oh yeah, like gross funguses on the feet because they were like cold and wet and dirty. Just like a mess. So yeah, so this is Tokyo after World War II. There are several cities in Germany that were just flattened. Dresden was one of them, where like if you go to Germany today, it's like they rebuilt the cities to look like they used to, but they're all built in like the 50s. So like when you go to Dresden was literally flattened. And even like in Poland, even in, Warsaw was totally flattened. And you go to Warsaw and it's just like, everything looks like it did. It looks like it could have been built in the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, but it wasn't. It was built in the 1950s, which is just kind of, I don't know, kind of crazy. Dang, this is all, I hope too much of this isn't cut off. All right, good to know. Okay, so the Green Revolution is an important topic for you to know. By flatten, I mean just like, you have a city with all the buildings, and then when you bomb it enough, all the buildings come down. And so it's just literally like flat. The Green Revolution was in, what is it called? It was designed in, because of drought that happened in India, a really massive drought in the 40s. And that led to trying to figure out new ways to produce food. So that's like what's cut off there is GMOs, and using different tactics to just be able to produce new food that isn't going to be so harmed by the environment. It's not going to harm the environment as much, and it's not going to be affected by like natural disasters as much. Exactly. So the Green Revolution is mostly happening in developing countries, right? So It's in India. It's in Bangladesh. It's in Latin America. And there's already been a DBQ about the Green Revolution, so chances are good that you will not see that one again. Maybe on the LEQ. So obviously this is a more like recent picture, but he's like spraying different types of like pesticides on them. I'm not sure exactly what he's spraying, but it will keep the wheat alive longer. All right, that is all of Key Concept 6.1. Okay, so we just kind of cut through all the science and the technology. Obviously, you can see here why there's so much space for a CCOT essay, you know, when you're really looking at change over time, especially if there was a CCOT essay about technology that extended into like period 5 or 4. I think that would be a great essay, but maybe kind of easy. I don't know. We'll see. Would we have to know more in depth of any of these? Or if we know just the stuff you talked about today, it will be okay. Yeah. Okay. So basically what I like to do is give you a good overview. If there's anything here that you are looking at and you're thinking, I don't know I wouldn't be able to explain that, then you would want to like write that down and read into it. But a lot of these things you don't need to know the specifics of Alzheimer's, you know, just knowing that that's a disease is useful. So for the most part, it's just like, this is just kind of the easy breakdown. All right, we got to keep going because we're for sure going to go over time. All right, so in Key Concept 6.2, this is all the global conflicts. So, all right, so if you have to go, that's okay. You can watch the replay. So in 6.2, we've got global conflicts. We're gonna talk about the world wars. We're gonna talk about all the other conflicts that existed. So the first thing to know is that you sort of have a collapse of the old empires. So in the early part of the century, in the 1910s, the Ottoman falls, basically because they lose World War I. Russia falls because of the Russian Revolution, and the Qing dynasty falls as the like nationalists take over. And then they're trying to immediately falls into a civil war that lasts for like 30 years. So, you know, Vladimir Lenin is a person to know. This is the guy behind the Russian Revolution, behind the Bolsheviks, you know, the rise of communism in Russia. And his form of communism is Leninism. It's based off of Marxism, but it's his own vision of what Russia should look like. And it will be a state-run system with a dictator, with you know, like national or collectivized agriculture, with secret police. I mean, it's pretty intense. Do we need to know Republic of China, guys? Chiang Kai-shek is someone good to know. Bolsheviks come to power by overthrowing the Tsar. There's like a couple of different revolutions. They try in 1905, that fails, kind of fails. I guess they succeed, but then the government that is put in place in between 1905 and 1917 is not very strong. That's like the Duma. And in 1917, there's two revolutions. There's the February and the October Revolution. It's the October Revolution that really overthrows it. So the Bolsheviks are the Red Army, and they're fighting the White Army. And so that's how the Bolsheviks win. Who were the Bolsheviks? They're mostly like middle class, lower class, maybe middle and lower class, working class. That's a better title for them. Okay. All right, so let's talk about decolonization. So throughout the that's funny. Throughout the 20th century is the process of decolonization. And essentially it's like you have all these colonies, you have imperialism in period 5. Throughout the 20th century is like movements towards independence. And those happen in two different ways. In some cases, they're negotiated, and in some cases, there's war. And so the negotiated ones are like India. And so India would have, you know, they're negotiating their peace with Britain, and then eventually have like a 2-state system. And I'll talk a little bit more about India in a second. And then in Ghana, same thing, that's negotiated peace. However, in Algeria, in Vietnam, and Angola, there's war first against the colonizer. And actually, two of these, Algeria and Vietnam, are both French. Angola is Portuguese. And so the French and the Portuguese are similar because they try to hang on to their colonies. The British are more like, just, all right, we'll figure it out. And so they first fight off the colonizers and then fall into a civil war based on what should happen next. I think that, actually, I'm not sure what Ghana was. Maybe they weren't British. Algeria and Vietnam were French. Angola was for sure Portuguese. Maybe someone can look up Ghana. I'm actually not sure what Ghana was. India was definitely British. British? Okay. So let's just talk a minute about India. The partition of India and India in the 20th century is a really important topic. And so what you have in India is, people in India want their like self-determination, right? They want their independence. They helped the British in World War I, and it was supposed to be in exchange for their independence, and then they are not given their independence. And then they continue to fight for it. Then World War II happens. And so Britain's like, we got to hold off on your independence. We got to fight this war. Come help us fight this war. And then we'll give you your independence. And so that's sort of how it plays out. And so you have, leaders like Gandhi, like Nehru is another one. And then you also have Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And so the biggest thing about India is that when it becomes clear that India will get its independence, which happens in 1947, the question around like what that will look like is important, because you have, India is a majority Hindu population, but there is a very significant Muslim population that Muhammad Ali Jinnah is the one to attach to the Muslim population. He's like their leader, and he is sort of fighting for their rights because he's concerned that as a minority population in one state, that they wouldn't get the same, wouldn't have equal rights. And Gandhi is like, no, it's okay. We can have one India and we can do this. We can do this together. But Jinnah is saying, let's just have two states. And so Jinnah sort of wins that. There's two states. And so you can see on this little map, Pakistan is kind of carved out of India, and it used to be West Pakistan and East Pakistan. East Pakistan becomes Bangladesh. So you could have lived in one area, in this green area right here, in between like 40 different years. You would have actually lived in 3 different countries, which is crazy, right? And you never moved. Like you didn't move anywhere, but you lived in India, and then you lived in Pakistan, and then you lived in Bangladesh. So this right here, though, what happens is extremely violent. And you get Muslims coming from India, moving to Pakistan, and then you have Hindus coming from Pakistan, moving to India, and they clash with each other. And about 1 million Indians will die as a result of this. It's incredibly violent. And even Gandhi loses his life because of some of this stuff. Gandhi's killed by a Hindu nationalist who believes that he was giving away too many rights, and that he wasn't like leading the Hindus properly. Okay, nationalist leaders. When did East Pakistan become Bangladesh? 1971. Oh, and then the other question about Algeria. Algeria is French. Algeria had a civil war in 1962. And Vietnam also had a civil war in 1954. Okay. Okay, so some of the nationalist leaders to know about, and actually I got pictures of them on the next one. So these 3 guys are very important in terms of independence movements and are very similar in how they promoted nationalism as a means to independence. So Gandhi would have done that in India, Ho Chi Minh was Vietnam, and Kwame Nkrumah was Ghana. And they're just like examples of nationalism existing in the colonized world and leading to independence through that. Something else about them, all three of these guys had trainings, had like Western educations. They studied in like Western societies, and all three of them, in terms of doing that, it's sort of like, you know, you read Western philosophy, Western political philosophy, things like the Enlightenment thinkers, and someone like Ho Chi Minh, you know, Vietnam used to be French. And so if you read the Declaration of Rights of Man, you know, if you're in Vietnam, you lived under French rule for so long, but that document certainly didn't apply to you. And so what he's kind of saying is like, they never cared about us, you know, like we can run our own country. We don't need them. They weren't, if, you know, they're hypocritical, essentially. What's the difference in nationalism and transnationalism or trans movements are ones that exist across state lines, across boundaries, countries. And so nationalism is like I don't know, this would be, right, exactly. Transnationalism would be like pan-Arabism, pan-Africanism, which they were, I guess Nkrumah was kind of part of, but the other two not as much. What I consider Kwame Nkrumah was definitely a peaceful leader. He became the first president of Ghana. So more about Kwame Nkrumah. I don't, you know, you don't need to know too much details about him. I wouldn't be able to tell you his whole life story. But he is essentially like Western educated, just like these other guys. He's in Ghana, and he is behind the movement to fight for Ghanaian independence, and he becomes the first president of Ghana. And that's sort of all that is about him in AP World. All right, so you feel like, I think that's enough about those three guys. It's like with this entire slideshow, I could go on and on and on forever about each slide, but you don't necessarily need to know everything about each person. Just being able to like compare, you can see that this is you know, even just seeing the similarities across these three different countries as becoming independent. They have, like, you can always use the fact that they have a strong leader as a reason why they became independent, you know, if that was a question that you got. And then these would be all evidence points. You could use all three of them as examples. Oh my God, do not watch the movie Gandhi. It's so long. I mean, Gandhi is like, he's someone who is like that, the term for the nonviolent movement that he kind of started is called Satyagraha. And it is essentially what influences like Martin Luther King and Mandela to use nonviolent movements. Okay, so some of the regional ethnic movements that occurred in here, and we talked a little bit about Jinnah, so we'll talk about him again. And this is the Quebecois separatist movement. This basically means like you have, in different regions, you have ethnic tensions, right? So like in India and Pakistan, you have Muslim versus Hindu. In Canada, you have a movement of people from Quebec they essentially want to secede because they speak French and they feel like they're not part of the rest of Canada. It's a fringe movement. Okay, so it's not like all of Quebec wants to secede. It's like when you hear about like Texas wanting to secede, it's like the same thing, you know? Is it going to happen? No, probably not. But that's something that's actually listed in the key concepts as an example. And yeah, it exists today. There are people, there is a separatist movement. There's a movement to make Quebec its own country, essentially. And you think about just like language, you know, that's people that share common language want their own state, you know. I think, so this is an awesome picture of Gandhi and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, because you can kind of see that divide between them. You know, they both want independence for India. They don't want to be a colony of Britain. They don't want to be exploited. However, they really have different ideas of what that would look like. Would this be related to Zionism? Zionism can be connected to nationalism. And in terms of regional ethnic movements, I mean, Zionism, though, kind of comes out of Europe, but I guess you could connect it to Zionist movements that exist in the Middle East as well. I think that works just fine. Okay, here you go. Here's your transnational movement. So like we talked about Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism, communism is one too. They're ideas, they're platforms that extend beyond boundaries, that cut into, like Zionism would definitely be a transnational movement. And Zionism is, yeah, it's for the Jewish state, right? So it's like wanting one state for Jews. And these are like feminism would also be a transnational movement. Things that it doesn't matter where in the world you live, you can get behind these things. Here are the, Pan-Africanism is just this idea that people of Africa are connected by common culture, common history, common tradition, and that together, like a lot of it is like in part of what you have in the 19th century is that you have, in order to colonize places, it's best if you keep people separate. So even in, like, if you look at South Africa, there was a lot of movements in the apartheid movement to literally pit people against each other, pit the like native communities against each other, because people who fight against each other are less likely to overthrow the like colonizer, right? So as you're colonizing Africa, it's in your best interest to make sure that the tribes don't get along, because then they won't work together to fight you. Same thing in all of like Arabia, right? It's best to pit people against each other. And so you can do that in any aspect. Weren't they divided by tribes though in South Africa? Yeah, right. So you have these different tribes, but the tribes could be working together against the colonizers, but they don't, because of literally like, yeah, like the Hutus and the Tutsis. It's stuff that is like the conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis was almost designed by the Belgians. Like it's a deeply rooted conflict that's not real, you know? It's like you come up with these different things and that's how you keep control over people. I mean, like you could even look at just like our country today, you know, like it's not like we have a whole movement up against the like, you know, to fight the man. We did keep disagreeing with each other, and it's harder to fight against that when that happens. Africa is so divided today. It's not all of Africa that's divided. It's some of Africa that's divided. And part of it is because you have, I mean, okay, so just to use Sudan as the example, Sudan is an example of a country where you can see those like straight boundaries. So there was no, you know, deference to where you know, who lives there and whatever. It's just like draw the line. So even like the group of like the Nubians, you know, Nubians end up living in part in Egypt, part in Sudan. They're totally divided by state lines, which gives them nearly like, it doesn't give them very much power because the entire Nubian population is in one region, but they were just divided because of a straight line. So you have, you know, conflict because people are forced to be in one state, but they don't actually share common culture, share common tradition. So Pan-Africanism is a movement that doesn't necessarily want to make Africa one country. It's just more of like, Africans should like work together with Africans because nobody else has our back, right? Like we have to work together to make things happen. We have to stop fighting each other. We have to start fighting our actual enemies. That's sort of it. Exactly. And Pan-Arabism is the same thing, right? Instead of fighting each other, we need to like understand that we have common language, common religion, common culture, history, you know, and those things are going to bring us together to fight the actual powers at play, right? It's kind of, yeah, the EU though would be much more like an actual system. Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism are ideas, they're theories. And you do have like a Pan-African Congress that comes up, and that's just sort of like a meeting of the minds kind of thing. But you don't necessarily have, you know, too much success with these things. You know, it's, I don't know. I could go on and on. Land redistribution is another, let's see. Land redistribution is another thing that comes about, and essentially it means the government will take the land that exists and redistribute it out to the people who are poor. And that it's one of those things that, like, I think sounds good in practice, and it never works in, sounds good in theory, never works in practice. And so it just ends up being a whole mess, and it usually leads to famine and deaths and conflict. And so here's a list of countries that tried to redistribute land. It's connected to like communism / socialism. So not all of these countries are communist, like Venezuela and Kenya do sort of like dip into some socialist policies and more like dictatorships. And so that would be more where that happens. But China, Russia, Vietnam, and Cuba are all communist. And so one example of this is, no, the Atlantic Revolutions is before. That's like way earlier. So this is more of like in the 20th century, Mao in China tries to collectivize agriculture. This would be the Great Leap Forward. And it's like, instead of you just like farming for yourself, you're farming for the community, and we're going to share what we have. But this will lead to something like 20 million deaths or something crazy. And it's just like, yeah, sharing is caring until you are like actually like killed for it or for not doing it, or are forced to give up stuff that would have kept you alive, right? And so the Great Leap Forward is just like a massive disaster. Yeah, we are done with the Chinese dynasty song. Okay, movement of people. So you have a large movement of people across the world because of global conflict. You have India and Pakistan, right? We talked about that. Israel, Palestine, right? There's lots of movements, people within there. And then you also have movements of people from former colony to like motherland, right? So like to, I hate that it's called motherland, but like, for example, South Africa used to be a colony of Great Britain throughout, especially through apartheid. And then afterwards, there is a large movement of South Africans to Great Britain. Algeria was a colony of France. Because of the Civil War, there's a large population of Algerians that moved to France. You know, they speak French. It's perfect. Filipinos to the US, same thing. Here's some Algerians in France, as though the 62 Civil War is like a really bloody civil war. And so there is a really big population of Algerians who do live in France, even today. And then I think the last two bullet points in here will be the world wars. But genocide is more than just the Holocaust. There's really 4 major examples of it that come up in the 20th century. There's more than 4. There's other ones as well. But we've got, these are in chronological order. So Armenia would be the genocide of the Christian Armenians by the Ottoman Turks in the 1910s. Then, of course, the Holocaust would be Nazi Germany. Cambodia is, and I think I have a picture of that here. So Cambodia, essentially, you have Pol Pot who comes to power. The Khmer Rouge, and he targets people who, like, he wants to make Cambodia, bring it back to be an agrarian society. And so anyone who is against that, so people who are intellectuals, students, teachers, play an instrument, wear glasses, anyone that like represents like modernism would have been killed. Anyone who is connected to the old regime would have been killed. So it's about 1 million, killing of intellectuals. So like just people who would have worked in colleges, professors, people who had higher degrees. Yeah, exactly. It's like, he hates it because it's a threat to him. He can keep control over a society of farmers much easier than a society of smart people, right? So people with glasses, his name is Pol Pot. And then Rwanda is in 94. That's the Hutus and the Tutsis. And I always forget which one killed the other. I've seen Hotel Rwanda 1 million times and I can never remember it. Whatever. All right, let's talk about the global wars. So World War I So listen, Hutus killed Tutsis. Thank you. Okay, so I need to find a way to remember that because I always run into that. So, all right. So in terms of both world wars, there are 4 causes, and they're like the main causes. So these are the 4 to know, right? MAIN, main causes. Both wars. Militarism. Militarism would be an increase in military production. So, like actually, like producing more arms, more weapons, and that's happening at the end of the 19th century, and then into the 20th century, right? And so what happens with that is that if people produce more weapons, they're more likely to use them. Alliances is another major factor. So what happens with alliances is there's a whole web of alliances made in Europe. And then when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand in World War I is killed, it sets off, like it triggers all the alliances. So, you know, because one group will declare war, a whole bunch of other countries are brought into the war, right? So it's like even in World War II, you have when the US declares war on Japan, Germany declares war on the US. Even though they're like totally separate, there's an alliance there. So that's the deal. Imperialism causes the war too because there's just constant competition for more and more colonies, more resources. And you actually have global war because of it. So like the Australians are involved because of Britain. The Egyptians are involved because of Britain. You know, like you have all these people fighting for the allies that are the actual colonies. When Germany, okay, so I'll talk through each war in a second. But let me just get through these last ones. So nationalism is your last one, where you have, like, nationalism can lead to violence because people think they're the best and they want to prove it. And the best way to prove it is to fight your enemy, right? Or to just fight anyone and win. And then you could look like the best. So if you memorize anything on this slide, memorize these 4 things. Main causes. All right, so let's just talk about World War I. So with World War I, you have, you essentially have the Archduke of Austria-Hungary that's assassinated in Sarajevo, which is in Bosnia. And that he's killed by a Serb nationalist. And so after a couple of weeks of debate, they end up declaring war on each other. And then all these other countries get involved. Russia, Italy, France, Great Britain, all, just really quickly, Belgium. The US doesn't want to be involved in the war, not until 1917. The only reason why they get involved is because of the Zimmermann telegram, which was basically Germany telling Mexico, hey, if you guys join us on our side and we win, we'll give you back all those lands that the US took from you. And then another big reason why the US doesn't join until 1917 is like Russia. So Russia gets out of the war in 1917 because of the Russian Revolution. And a lot of Americans like don't want to fight on the same side as the Russians. Pettiness. So they kind of, it's kind of a lot lines up in 1917 to be like, all right, now's the time. The US joins the war. The war ends like a year after the US joins it. So, but at the end of the war, it's kind of like with either world war, you don't have to know the battles. You don't have to know the ins and outs of the actual war. You do need to know the causes and you need to know the effects. And so the end of World War I is much more important than the actual war because you have the Treaty of Versailles. So with the Treaty of Versailles, there's going to blame Germany for everything. So, when you really look at it, it's much more complicated. It's not really all Germany's fault, but Germany gets the blame for the entire war. They are made to pay insane reparations. They have to lower their army. They're just treated extremely harshly. All of their colonies are taken away from them. And so that treaty will essentially lead to World War II because people are pissed. And so that's one of the reasons why Nazism is able to grow in Germany. Was the Zimmermann telegram fake or was it real? So I think it was real. I've never heard that it was fake. I don't know. what the Zimmerman was basically just like Germany, the war, like the U.S. getting involved in the war was inevitable. Germany sent a telegram to Mexico that said, if you guys join the war and you join us and we win, you'll get back all of your territories that the U.S. took from you. Sounds conveniently intercepted by the U.S. I don't know. I mean, it's been a part of like the story I tell about World War One for as long as I've told it. Maybe, who knows? I've never heard that it could be fake. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't. So, all right, let's talk about World War II. The question was, when Germany invaded Poland and triggered World War II, was it Great Britain that declared war on Germany first? Yeah. So Italy was switched sides in World War One. They were on the Central Powers and they switched to the Allies. Then in World War II, they're always on the what are they called in World War II? The Axis powers. So, okay, so just to give you a little rundown of World War II. In between the wars, and we'll talk more about the Great Depression and stuff in 6.3, but in between the wars, you have the Great Depression. And the Great Depression hits Germany incredibly hard. You have inflation is just like insane. So much so that like the value of dollars was less than wallpaper. So people were actually like putting dollars as wallpaper because it was cheaper. It just meant they just had no value anymore. And so Hitler really capitalizes on all of that, on the economy, on the anger about the war and the Treaty of Versailles, the frustrations. And so Hitler rises to power. And yes, you're right, Jamie, they do. So Hitler rises to power and he's elected in 1933. So the way that he wins is just literally like it's complicated, but he wins an election. And as soon as he's elected, we'll get to that in a second, Dylan. As soon as he's elected, he, enacts all these different powers and starts his like expansionist movement. So they go into Austria and Czechoslovakia, and Great Britain is kind of the appeasement. This is what's called appeasement. So Neville Chamberlain, who's Prime Minister of Great Britain, pretty much says, okay, we'll let you take, I think it was Czech. I think they had already taken Austria, and this was about Czechoslovakia. And so the thing was like, we'll let you take Czechoslovakia and then you'll stop there. And then they sort of like shake hands, right? And Hitler is obviously like, okay, sure, Neville, and like immediately goes back on that. So appeasement is constantly, historians look at that moment and never want to recreate it because you don't want to give a dictator what he wants. And that's a lesson learned. And so World War II, the actual war, whatever, it's won in Europe because of like the U.S. involvement, just like strong forces, and it's funny. And it's won in the Pacific because of island hopping. That's a key term that you can know. Yeah, exactly. All right. Okay, so the Cold War is really just your capitalism versus your communism, right? You have the US and Western Europe and all of their influences on one side. You've got Soviet Union and then China and Cuba and Korea and Vietnam on the other side. And then you also even have a group of countries who are like, leave us out of it. And they're called the third way. So it's like capitalism is the first world, communism is the second world, and then there's this third way, and that tends to be the third world countries. So really, I mean, this is a good like image of it. The Cold War lasts from 1945 to 1991. It is, and I can give you a quick rundown of what it looked like in each century. Okay, so let's just go through. Yeah, okay. So let me just give you a really quick rundown of each decade. I don't know why I said century. So in the 1940s, it begins. Okay, the tensions sort of start before then, but in the 1940s, some of the key terms that you can know are like the Berlin airlift. And just in general, like this is when we have Berlin divided in terms of East and West, and you have Germany divided in terms of East and West. And so their tensions are high. By the end of the 1940s, China falls to communism, and the Soviet Union have nuclear weapons by the end of the 40s. So it's like the 40s is just like everyone getting prepared. The 1950s is more about paranoia. Everyone now has nuclear weapons. Are they going to use them? Is communism going to spread? Right? You've got people freaking out everywhere. And that's sort of the right. That's sort of the like, that's the background of the 50s, is just paranoia. The 60s is when we get as close as possible to actually going to war. That's the Cuban Missile Crisis. In terms of the proxy wars that exist, so knowing the word proxy war is good. It's like the Soviet Union and the United States fought each other, but not directly. So, excuse me, it's not like they actually, shoot at each other. They fight each other through these other countries, through Vietnam, through Korea. And so the 60s is just like the tensions are high. The highest point of tensions is the 60s. By the 70s, everyone's like, we got to cool this shit off. We cannot keep going on the path that we're going on. We've got to calm down. And that's what's called detente. And there's a process to really limit the amount of weapons that everybody has, so that it's not just like constantly trying to get more and more and more, but stop and like settling down, and so that they can limit it. That's the SALT treaties. How do you spell detente? It's spelled like this. And then there's a little thing over one of the E's too. And then the 80s is just like, okay, we got to end this. So in the 80s, the way that it ends is because there's a couple of reasons here. And you can compare this to the fall of any empire, of why the Soviet Union falls. The Soviet Union is overextended. They get involved in a war in Afghanistan that takes almost the entire decade of the 80s, and they're severely in debt. And meanwhile, Reagan is spending more and more and more money on the military, and the Soviets can't keep up. Then you have just general, like, with mass media, with technology, people within Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union know that life is not as good there as it is in capitalist countries. And so, right. And then you have protests. You have just actual, dissent. And then you have a leader, Gorbachev, who's really willing to have reforms. And so those reforms, so Dylan mentioned one is perestroika, and the other one is glasnost. One of them is economic reforms. One of them, I think perestroika is, it's not private property. It's, one of them is just like freedom of the press. The other one is freedom of the economy. Perestroika is economy. Restructuring of the economy. There we go. So then glasnost is allowing for more freedom of the press. So that's pretty much how the Cold War ends. All right, I pretty much explained the whole Cold War in about 5 minutes. That's pretty good. Yes, it is important. Those are two terms that are really worth it to know, because those are really why the Cold War ends. I know we're past the hour. I'm going to keep going. So, you're welcome to log out and watch the replay, or just stick around. So just to finish out the global conflicts, you've got the non-aligned movement is what I was talking about. It's countries like Egypt that don't want anything to do with the Cold War. You've also got uprisings. You have student protests that happen around the world, like in all different places, in 1968 and in 1989. Those are like 2 big years in terms of student protests. In 68, yeah, you're going to see protests in Chicago, in Paris, in Prague, in Mexico City. There's like massive ones. In 1989, yep, you have Tiananmen Square. You have all kinds of different ones in 1989. Yep, Prague Spring is in 1968. Yep. And then dictators are just showing the different dictators that come about in this time period. Yeah, so student protest 1968, you've got, here we go, the list. There's just all kinds of stuff. And to be honest, you guys, in a lot of ways, I feel like 2018, when we look back at things, is going to be compared to 1968. 2000, what happened in Prague? Prague, like, is part of Czechoslovakia, is part of the Soviet Union. And so they are protesting for more freedoms, and they are put down by tanks, essentially. So it's like the story of protests. There's Tiananmen Square. This is the super famous picture of the guy standing in front of the tank. And this one is very much squashed as well with violence. All right, global conflicts, check. One more key concept. I told you this one is just like the most. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit. So when we talk about economics in the 20th century, there's like two different, there's two different like ways that people are responding to economic crises. One way is the communist response of like, how do we, like, this is how communists try to have better, better economies. 5-year plans. Great Leap Forward is China. Cultural Revolution is China. 5-year plans is Soviet. Here's like communist economic policy. This is just kind of showing some stuff in the Soviet Union. All of these things honestly lead to deaths. So good job, communists. The capitalist response is more about, like, at first, social welfare. So just the idea that like the government should help people is relatively new. The government wasn't trying to give a lot of handouts throughout all of history. And so this is sort of coming out of the New Deal and liberalism, and like moving away from like laissez-faire, that like when there's a crisis, when the stock market crashes, the government has a responsibility to step in. Whereas with laissez-faire, it's like, it'll fix itself. But this is much more about helping people. And then you've got the free market policies that happen as a result of that. So it's like you have liberalism, and then you have a backlash of conservatism. And so this is Reagan. This is more of like the, what is it called? Reaganomics. It's still semi-laissez-faire though, because the government doesn't own the economy, right? Right. I mean, right. Like the government still is not like dictating the economy. It's market-based. So it's like supply, demand, But at the same time, the government does have more of a hand in it now than ever before. Like think about like the bailouts, right? Anytime the government bails out a business that's failing, that's the government interfering, right? Whereas laissez-faire, like strict laissez-faire policy would have told Obama or, even like any of the bailouts that have happened, like leave them alone. If they're going to fail, they're going to fail. That's on them, right? So I know I'm not talking bad about Obama, but right, that's not necessarily like that's against laissez-faire. So basically, you can see social welfare programs are just a bunch of white dudes signing bills. That's what the New Deal is. Because this is world history, you don't have to know all that much about the New Deal, just that it is an example of social welfare, an example of government policies meant to specifically help people unemployed people, help people who need supports, help them get jobs, those kinds of things. Okay, international political organizations. So as part of like this idea of globalization, you have just like, more organized efforts to stop wars, right? These really confuse you. So basically, the League of Nations is the first attempt. The idea with the League of Nations is just, World War I sucked. How do we prevent it? We don't want to do that again. So let's have an organization where all the countries will be part of it, and we'll work things out before we go to war. But the League of Nations itself was kind of weak, and the US was never in it. And so it was kind of destined to fail. Exactly. The UN is like the 2.0 version, and they lay out a stronger system where the UN actually has its own like military force. No, NAFTA is trade. So the UN is just United Nations. That's just about like diplomacy. NAFTA is a trade policy. Yeah, exactly. The International Criminal Court is coming out after the Holocaust. It's just trying to like keep people accountable, you know, like you can't just kill all these people and have no consequences. And so if your country is not going to try you, there should be some larger thing to do that. So it's not just like, okay, we'll try you in the US. It's like you can be tried on international tribunals. I wonder what year this is. So this is the UN. The UN is located in New York, and they meet, you know, pretty regularly, and they like a lot of, you know, maybe a lot of the reasons why we haven't had a major war since World War II is because of the UN. Who knows? So you also, you know, you have international political organizations, but you also have international economic ones too. Things like the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, World Trade Organization. These are organizations that exist internationally to control trade. So NATO would not be an international economic organization. The EU would be. I think I have it. Where do I have? Here we go. Okay, so those are more trade. So the IMF and the World Bank are basically trying to. No, you really don't have to know about them specifically. Know that they're both examples of the international economic organizations. I mean, the IMF is essentially just like promoting trade through like stabilizing exchange rates, right? So instead of it being so confusing as to what $1 in one country equals how much in another, it sort of like stabilizes those exchange rates. Okay, so that's just those two. Humanitarian organizations, these are ones that help people around the world. UNICEF is, I don't think I have a picture of them. UNICEF is for children. It's like the United, I don't remember what it stands for, but this was specifically to help children in Western Europe after World War II who were poor, who were orphans, homeless. Amnesty International helps refugees. The Red Cross is developed essentially during the end of the 19th century. It actually comes out of the Civil War, but it becomes international during World War I. And so you've got all of these nurses that work on the front line. So that's a huge game changer for war, because instead of like, you know, if you're injured in war, if you don't have medical supplies with you, you might not survive. And so the Red Cross provides that. United Nations Children's Fund. Oh, there we go. United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund. Cool. Okay, so here's the ones you guys are asking about. Trade agreements. The EU is really more of a trade agreement, right? So it doesn't regulate money. Like, I guess, okay, because they have a currency, I guess it fits into a little bit more. But the EU, NAFTA, CEDAW is Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. NAFTA is North American Free Trade Association, North American Free Trade Association. And the EU is the European Union. It used to be called the European Community, and then it changed over to the EU, and it promotes, it essentially just like eliminates borders in Europe, right? You can trade freely and go work freely and move freely. So the USSR has the Warsaw Pact, which I guess I should have written down here. But China does not have, no, because China would have been more from before. NATO would have been, what does NATO stand for? North American Trade Organization? No. North Atlantic Treaty Organization. So NATO is actually more of political. And maybe I do include it somewhere, maybe I'm not. So I guess you would include NATO as, Um, hmm. So NATO, yeah, NATO is more of an alliance. It's a political alliance between the Western countries. And then in response to that is the Warsaw Pact. And so it's not really any of these things. These are more like, yeah, I think just think of it as an alliance. Okay. Communist countries versus containment. Yeah. Multinational corporations. So you've got things like Shell, Coca-Cola. I mean, anything on here, any of these organizations that exist are multinational. You know, they exist in more than one country. Not only do people use them across the world, they even have headquarters around the world, right? And so this is, you know, McDonald's is a big one. And even just like the term McDonaldization, it's like the spread of American values throughout the world. And all of these organizations are a big reason for it. Why does American culture spread? Because of these things, you know? There are a ton of McDonald's around the world. Would Coca-Cola be considered cultural imperialism? Yeah, for sure. Yeah, because we're like pushing these things on them. We get them hooked, you know? What are conglomerates? That was a random one. In terms of what? Like corporate conglomerates? I don't even know. Isn't that just like, is that like a monopoly? Yeah, I think it's a monopoly. Oh, I think it would be like something like, I don't have it on me, but it's really, if you think about like our media, and some of our big brands in America, they're all actually owned by like 4 or 5 different organizations. So it's probably that all of these things, even all the ones listed here, are like owned by other people. Maybe not all of them, but when the USSR rejected Coca-Cola and accepted Pepsi, I know, would you say that the Cold War turned into the Cola War? Sure. A number of different things or parts that are put, yeah. So it's monopolies, conglomerates. Okay, so environmental movements we talked about a little bit, but some of the specific ones to know would be Greenpeace and Earth Day. I'll answer your question in a second, Brandon. So you've got, you know, movements for saving the environment that really like take hold. They kind of start in the early 20th century, but people like Rachel Carson and like start to develop platforms for this. Brendan's question was the difference between cultural imperialism and cultural globalization. So cultural imperialism, let's just go back to this one. Cultural imperialism would be when you are controlling and exploiting a country through culture. You know, you get them hooked on things, on different like factors that come, you know, in a culture, whether it's a brand or an idea or something, and you're forcing that on them. And it could even be as much as like forcing religion on them, things like that. Cultural globalization is just the like natural spread of things. So I think the main difference would be more of like, you know, the world gets smaller in terms of our culture, and things are so much more widespread. But, you know, with imperialism, it's more forced. Yeah. Would a DBQ ever ask an ideological question? The DBQ always asks something larger. I mean, it's not just going to ask you, it might, like socialism and communism could be answers to the DBQ. It just depends. But they could. Would the Opium Wars be an example of cultural imperialism? Yeah. I would say so. Actually, the Opium Wars is kind of economic imperialism. Okay, so there are human rights movements throughout the century. They, you know, for example, Declaration of Human Rights is after World War II. And if you read the Declaration of Human Rights, by the way, it's kind of ridiculous because it's like, it's just a list of things that we want to be true about human society. And like, there's no way that anyone's actually enforcing them, because so many of those things have been or are being, violated. Feminist movements, movements for women in the 20th century. You have the first wave of feminism with suffrage, and then that's kind of like the 19th into the 20th century. And then you have the second wave of feminism that is for, it's for equal rights. So, and White Aussie is like, they have an immigration policy that's basically throughout the 20th century that is trying to keep Australia white, and it limits immigration from non-white countries. And so there's a movement in the 20th century to end that. So here's some of the feminist protests in the 60s. The National Organization for Women, Betty Friedan. These are important names to know. This is a name to know. This is an organization. And they're like, the feminist movements that happen are really global. It's not just in the US. And a couple of questions where they'll never take off for your opinion. Right. So just try to keep whatever you write focused to what is being asked of you. But any argumentative essay has an opinion. You're taking a stance. You're putting your opinion on there. You're saying this is a cause or this is an effect. And so what makes it not just your opinion, what makes it an argument, is that you're using evidence. So you're not just saying, I think this. You're saying this was a cause because of blank. That just makes it a little bit stronger. How does the gold standard relate to the economic organizations? Honestly, Melody, don't waste a lot of time studying the gold standards and the silver standards. That's going to be much more in economics. It's just like, it's like really complicated, and it's only related to the economic organizations in terms of one that I didn't even list on there called Bretton Woods. And it just decided on almost like the dollar, the US dollar being a standard of exchange. But don't get too into that. A quick note on religion and politics is fundamentalism. This would be the Iranian Revolution, for an example, in 1979. This is Ayatollah Khomeini. If you've ever seen Argo, the very first scene in Argo is awesome to show you what this looked like. But it's really like a backlash against Western culture spreading in Iran. So, and it's a push to return Iran to like more fundamental Islamic values. And Iran is predominantly Shia, which the rest of the Islamic world is mostly Sunni. And so there's always tensions between that. And like, obviously even now. And I mean, the guy who was in charge before Khomeini, his name was Shah Pahlavi, and he was essentially backed by the US. And so there just is this like massive anti-American, anti-Western movement in Iran. And it leads to this revolution that happens, which is not great. All right. And then the very last thing is the diffusion of pop culture, the spread of things. And don't overlook these, you guys. The Olympics has been a topic on a DBQ. There was an entire DBQ about the Olympics. Like when you think about the World Cup, when you think about the Olympics, when you think about reggae, they transcend one country. It comes into so much more, and it creates this new like international pop culture. Things like Bob Marley, things like Bollywood that are popular everywhere. Exactly. Exactly. So this is just like oh man, the PDF doesn't work. He drops the mic there. So anyways, this is key concept 6.3. Obviously there's a lot. I know he's supposed to drop a mic here, but he is not dropping a mic because this is a PDF. What are the main goals of regional trade? The main goals of the trade agreements are to make trade more free. Yeah, I mean, they say 20%, so I have to like believe that's true. I know it feels like it might not be true, but I think that they do a lot of work to make sure that that is true. from what I've seen. I know a lot of APUSH students were tweeting today about their test like being heavily like too much earlier stuff. I think if you really look at the test and break it down and do some data around it, you would find that it's probably pretty even to what they say. I don't know. Well, free trade can be international. International just means you're trading between nations. Free trade means that it's easy to do so, that you don't have to pay these high tariffs, you don't have to pay, different things. It's easy to trade. That up soon. All right, y'all. Have a good night. You're ready to work. Get some rest though, too. Well, it's not totally over. We got plenty more to do. Okay, see y'all later. Good night.